Big time Tony P said, if Tony Khan asked you to turn AEW around and make it a successful company that could compete with WWE, what would you do first?
Take him off television.
I thought you were going to say turn him down.
Either that or
Close enough.
either that or turn him heel. He'd make a great obnoxious heel, wouldn't he?
Yes.
But he is not a baby face. The guy should not be anywhere near a red light on anything that looks like it might be a camera. It just, you should not. Not in your quasi cosplay press conferences or media scrums or whatever you're trying to present. Just nothing. Let somebody else be the face of your company. When AEW first started, what I was excited about is it appeared for a couple months like Chris Jericho was going to be kind of the face of the company because we were hearing a lot from Chris about AEW and and I thought, okay, that kind of makes sense. And then all of a sudden I'm seeing Tony, and I'm going, ooh, somebody must love him enough to tell him that this is not a good idea. I mean, somebody got to have a girlfriend or parent or brother, sister, anybody say, hey, Tony, I don't know, TV, let somebody else be the face of the company. That'd be number one. Number two is I would hire somebody that really understood professional wrestling, that was a fan like Tony, that really loved the product, but loved it because of its story potential. Somebody that knew wrestling, but also really understood the story. And there's actually a guy like that out there. He's a Harvard graduate. He's a really smart guy. He's won awards for writing a book about Shakespeare's called Shakespeare's Proleptic Characters. Pull that right out of my ass, didn't I? But he could tell you could call him up right now. I've had him on the show. I'm not going to mention his name because I don't want him to get a bunch of heat. But I've had him on the show, and we've broken down some of the best stories in WWE. And he can make a comparison and draw an analogy to classic stories from Greek literature or Shakespeare and show you how that storytelling structure applied to certain stories within professional wrestling. In some cases, were almost mirror images in terms of story structure. So you've got to have somebody that you can't just bring in a Hollywood writer. Okay. Been there, done that. Doesn't work. But if you can find somebody that really understands story structure and what makes a great story, but also understand the wrestling audience, because the televised wrestling audience is different than a sitcom audience or different than an action show audience or different than a dramatic series audience. Okay. There are similarities. There's crossover. Always is. Entertainment's entertainment. But the wrestling audience is a little bit unique. So you have to have a sense of the wrestling audience, the mainstream audience, not the hardcore internet wrestling geeks that populate the AEW audience for the most part. But the 2.5 million other people that love wrestling, they just don't care for the internet wrestling style of storytelling or lack thereof. So find somebody that really understands it, both sides of the culture, storytelling culture and wrestling culture, and build a team around that person and fix creative, because creative is a mess currently in AEW. I don't care what anybody says. You can kid yourself all you want. If I was wrong, the ratings would be growing like they are in WWE. And I'm not wrong. As painful as it may be to you AEW trolls out there who live for an opportunity to bury me on social media. By the way, the funny thing is every time I say something like this, my social media lights up a couple hours later and I'm getting buried. And I go, I wonder who these people are. And I click on him. He's got like 8 followers, 2 followers. These are people that are just living in little tiny bubbles. And they're passionate about what they're passionate about, but it doesn't take away from the fact that I'm absolutely right. Creative needs to get fixed. And that's the first thing that I would focus on.
Flair fan at Steeler fan 8771 said, from the outset, why didn't you have the same regard, respect for Flair that you seemingly had for Hogan, Savage, Piper, Nash, Hall, and others?
That's a good question. it's not that I had any different level of respect, but business was different with those individuals. Ric Flair was in WCW before I got there as an announcer. Literally 48 hours after I got there, my first day of work in 1991, Flair left WCW. And he came back after I was made executive producer, despite the fact that he claims that he's the one that got me the job. I already had the job before he came back. Whatever. Minor point. I forget shit, dude. Doesn't matter. So when Flair came, and I didn't know of Ric Flair. I know this sounds like a disrespectful things to say, but you have to remember, I was living in Minneapolis before I got hired to come to work for Turner Broadcasting. I didn't get TBS on my cable system. I didn't watch it. So I didn't know about NWA. I didn't know about TBS. I didn't know about WCW on TBS. I knew nothing about it or anybody in it. I didn't watch Florida Championship Wrestling. I didn't watch World Class Wrestling. I didn't watch Mid-South Wrestling because it wasn't available to me. The only thing that I knew was AWA and Vern Gagne and the people that came in and out of that tour. One of which, by the way, was Hulk Hogan. And I know Ric Flair started in AWA, and I think he was there in 1973. I think he trained with Brad Ring. May have trained with Brad Riggins, but he trained in the farm, in the barn, I guess, Vern and his team. But Rick left the territory very, very soon afterwards and was in NWA and Florida, wherever he was in the South that I wasn't aware of. So I didn't know of Rick the way I knew of Hulk and Randy and others. So the perception probably was that I had less respect for Rick, but that is not true. Rick and I got along great for a long time. 94, we were thick as thieves. I gave him the job as head of creative. My wife and his former wife and his kids and my kids all hung out at the beach or at the pool at the yacht club in Disney World whenever we were down there producing television. Rick invited my family down to St. Martin, and we produced a wrestling event down there, that Rick wanted to do because he had a Gold's Gym down in St. Martin. So I worked with Rick to make that happen, and we hung out. We had a blast. So my relationship with Rick wasn't always tenuous, and there were a lot of times when it was great. It wasn't until later when the stakes got higher, egos got more sensitive, my decisions became more controversial. My personality probably changed. I went from being a fairly happy-go-lucky, easy to get along with. I wasn't under a lot of pressure. I didn't have to make choices that pissed people off or hurt people's feelings or disappointed them or crush their egos. I wasn't in that position. But once I was in that position and the stakes became higher and the egos became more sensitive, my reaction to certain things with Rick, I do regret. I could have been more conscious of, I don't want to make Rick sound like a sensitive guy, although he is. He wears his emotions on his sleeve. We all know that. I could have been more careful about the way I handled certain situations and treated Rick with more respect than I did. But it didn't start out that way. It ended up that way. And part of that was my fault. Part of that was Rick's fault. It just happened. When I say fault, part of it was my role in the company at that time, and part of it was because of Rick's role in the company at that time. And I'm not saying I didn't do things that were disrespectful. I'm saying the opposite. I did, and I wish I wouldn't have. But it's not that it started out that way. So it's the best way I can answer that.